Hello and welcome to today's podcast interview. We have Erika Quinn and Holly Yanacek with us today. They're the editors of the edited volume Animals, Machines and AI on Human and Non-Human Emotions in Modern German Cultural History, which was published last November in the series Interdisciplinary German Cultural Studies, which is edited by Erika Quinn. Erika, Holly, good morning, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
So could you start by telling me a little bit about the background of the volume, how it came to be?
Yeah, we'd be happy to. The idea for the volume developed from a number of observations. Recent fascination with emotions, developments in robotics, and the growth of animal studies in and beyond the academy have given rise to questions about the nature of humanity. Over the past few decades, a post-human or non-human turn has emerged in the humanities and social sciences. Posthumanism invites us to question the concept of the human. What does it mean to be human? How have ideas about humanity changed over time? Can so-called non-humans, such as non-human animals and machines, show emotions or exhibit other signs of humanity? These kinds of questions have occupied the minds of writers and philosophers for centuries. Responding to historical, social, and cultural changes of their time, writers have given creative expressions to questions and anxieties about the core of human identity. In spring 2018, related to my research interests, I developed a new literature course focused on these questions for James Madison University's general education program. The course, Humanities 200 Great Works of Literature, introduced students to literature from different historical periods and cultures, with a particular emphasis on literary fiction about animals and machines by Germanophone writers. In the work studied in that course, we encountered anthropomorphized animals, sentient robots, and different patterns of relationship between the human and non-human figures. Emotions and empathy were especially important in blurring boundaries between human machine and human animal in a number of these works. Fast forward to fall 2018, Erika and I joined Derek Hillard as co-chairs of the GSA Emotion Studies Network, and I proposed Feeling Beyond the Human as the topic of the seminar we organized for that conference. The plans for the volume became concrete after that seminar.
And as we started to explore the idea of this volume, I certainly noticed, and I know Holly also noticed, that the idea of emotional entanglement between humans and non-humans seemed to be an increasingly visible part of the zeitgeist, especially since the pandemic began, and we can talk more about that later. But also, as an avid reader of speculative fiction, I think that we're going through a huge renaissance and surge of interest in AI and robots as fictional characters, and there are many, many series exploring those entities' emotional worlds. So it seems like it's a very current topic. And, animals have been anthropomorphized for millennia, and they continue to be so. So these not only are scholarly questions, but also ones I think that a lot of people are asking.
Yeah, I mean, and as you said, the topic is very relevant today in particular, and it's also very interdisciplinary. It brings together many different trends in research, the history of emotions, animal studies, AI research in the humanities. How does the volume combine these approaches? That can't have been an easy feat.
Yeah, great question, Myrto. The volume is really interdisciplinary, and we're so happy it found a good home in this Gruyter series. The volume aims to put topics and approaches, as you said, in animal studies, posthumanism, gender studies, science and technology studies, and the history of emotions in dialogue. Although we draw on and integrate scholarship in these diverse areas, we approach our objects of study primarily through an emotion studies or a history of emotions lens. Some of the central questions we ask in the volume include, for example, what kinds of emotional lives have been attributed to non-human animals and machines in German cultural history, and why? Which emotional functions have non-human animals and machines served in different historical periods? What are the implications of emotional attachments to and empathy for non-humans, such as companion animals and social robots?
And just adding on what Holly's brought up, the field of emotion studies, I think, is in itself super interdisciplinary, and our interest in history of emotions certainly added to that. And we really saw a place for collaboration across not only different scholars, contemporary scholars, but also using lots of different disciplinary primary sources to make the arguments that we made. We also noticed, certainly with this volume, that there wasn't nearly as much attention to non-human animals in the German-speaking world as there has been in the Anglophone world, which has a robust literature in animal studies. So that was another contribution we wanted to make.
That was actually going to be one of my next questions, why you chose to focus on the German-speaking world specifically, but I think you answered that question, Erika. But how about, I mean, there are also other, you mentioned gender studies, Holly. Can you tell us a little bit more about how gender studies came into the book?
Sure, I could speak something to that. Thinking about non-human animals and entities, we noticed that gender is a key category through which humans understand the world. And as we project our emotions, perceptions, motivations onto these other entities and non-human animals, we thought that gender was really a central theme and a place to provide a thread for our contributors to organize around. We found a lot of traction and fruitful dialogue among the contributors regarding gender.
And the contributors themselves were all coming from different disciplinary backgrounds as well.
Yes, Holly's a Germanistin, I'm a historian. Most of our contributors are either literature scholars or historians. There are people who work with art history as well, but certainly our source bases were pretty diverse.
So yeah, visual culture seemed to be a particular focal point of the volume. What kinds of archival or primary sources did researching the volume involve?
Yeah, I think that when we started the project, we didn't necessarily have visual culture sources in mind as a central component, like you said, Myrto, but many of our contributors brought that up. And as we were working on the introduction, there were a lot of images that kind of just came to mind as we were thinking through this. So we do have contributors who are working with early 19th century photographs, with art images of non-human animals. And certainly Holly and I contributed in the introduction some discussion about Gerhard Richter's work, as well as some 19th century industrial images by Adolf von Menzel. And, you know, in addition to those visual sources that were so important, we also had a nice collection of different kinds of primaries that people addressed, from high educated sources like the biologist Uexküll or social theorists like Marx, 19th century philosophers like Theodor Lipps or Herder. But there are also more popular sources. Holly and my contributions both deal with popular fiction through children's fiction or the science fiction metropolis. So we had a nice collection, I think.
Yeah, and in addition to the visual and popular sources Erika mentioned, in terms of German language literary sources, there are a number of texts addressed in the volume, especially in the introduction. We begin the introduction with a discussion of course, Olympia, the famous automaton in E.T.A. Hoffmann's Der Sandmann, followed by an analysis of one of Franz Kafka's short prose works that has been translated into English as The Animal in the Synagogue. Other important authors referenced include Hugo Tawada, Memoirs of a Polar Bear, important novel, for example, Rainer Maria Rilke, Thier von Harbaut, as Erika said, Gerhard Hauptmann, and Robert Musil. As Erika said, we're excited to see that many German-speaking writers continue to take up the topics of human-animal relationships and robotics in their works.
And I suppose this is only more the case since the pandemic began. And there's ever more talk of AI, human, non-human relations, also in the German media. It's clear that this topic has become a lot more relevant in the past couple of years. And you wrote the book and edited it during the pandemic. That must have been very challenging. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
I think it was both challenging and super rewarding. As Holly mentioned, we had the seminar in 2018. So by the spring of 2020, we were really starting to work intentionally on the introduction and the collaborative essays. And we live hundreds of miles apart anyway, so we would have had to work remotely from each other. But our newfound adeptness with Zoom certainly helped, and really great document sharing software. We didn't Dropbox, all of that, of course, existed beforehand, but it became even more important in the pandemic. So in addition, there were also challenges about getting sources. Many libraries were shut down, as you know, so it needed a lot of creativity to find online sources or accessible sources or colleagues who had things to contribute. But those difficulties were offset, certainly for me, with having a project that we were both so passionate about to really focus on and absorb ourselves in a really difficult time, and feel like there was a connection and some purpose in what we were doing. So that was a really unexpected and lovely outcome.
I completely agree with everything Erika just said. And Myrto, as you said, we were surprised compared to when we started the project, how during the pandemic and spring and summer 2020, that our research suddenly became more relevant and more meaningful than before. The pandemic specifically made us more aware of the importance of animals and new technologies in our daily lives. We were so grateful for the company of our companion animals. Erika and I dedicated the volume to our canine companions. And we also noticed that increase in adoptions of so-called pandemic pets at this time. For the early months of the pandemic, communication among members of different households, as we're speaking today via Zoom, that became the norm, communication across a distance and through a screen. And new technologies, we noticed, increasingly mediated human social and emotional relationships. As Erika said, we depended on Zoom to co-write and edit the volume, to teach our classes remotely at our universities. And also Starship autonomous delivery robots appeared on JMU's campus in spring 2020 as well. And I've enjoyed watching students interact with them since then.
I suppose it doesn't happen very often in the context of, when you're working on research in history, or also less so in cultural studies as well. It doesn't happen very often that reality feeds into research so readily, and that something as huge and as mixed as the pandemic was in fact kind of a lucky coincidence when it comes to your developing your thinking, the thinking that went into this volume. So what are you both working on now? Anything that follows up on the edited volume?
I am I'm chewing on German, maybe fourth generation attempts to address wartime trauma. And I've been noticing as I've been kind of just sampling the literature that and I also wonder if this is related to the pandemic. I think a lot of us have become much more attuned to our interconnection and our interdependence. And some of the literature I'm seeing coming out of Germany, or the podcasts or the webinars, really tries to look at the collective and our interconnection as a source for healing. I see biologists doing this. I see mental health practitioners focusing on it. So that's a very early stages. It's more a question than a project right now, but I would say that in part comes out of this experience. And I'm also finishing up a microhistory that looks at the experience of grief primarily, but also how emotions in wartime are extremely complex, and for German women that those experiences of trying to navigate one's personal grief, one's political allegiances, and complicity or collaboration with a repressive regime. It's a pretty complex topic, but I really am enjoying bringing a history of emotions approach to that.
So you're moving away from research on the non-human then?
For now, I certainly, Holly and I are talking about potential new topics. We do really want to produce something else together. And my heart lies with animals right now. And I feel like more and more, I'm just kind of keeping my feelers alert to that.
Well, so am I. I'm very excited to see what you two work on next. How about you, Holly? What's your current project on?
So at the moment, I'm getting back to a project that I paused on for a few years. So I'm going back to working on my first monograph, a study of emotion discourse in fin de siècle German literature, provisionally titled Rethinking Feeling. So still informed by emotion studies approaches. And I'm still teaching a course. I'm actually working with colleagues in integrated science and technology studies at my university. I've developed some new modules for the Humanities 200 course this semester. So I'm still working in the non-human direction, and I'm in the very early stages of exploring a new potential book project on something like post-human care, so care, emotion, and the novel in the age of artificial intelligence, which could expand to look at care, in kind of other contexts as well, not just post-human. So that's what I'm working on in the moment. And as Erika said, we are eagerly looking for new collaborations. We still are involved in organization for emotion studies seminars in the German Studies Association.
That all sounds very exciting and continues to be very topical and very relevant to what is going on at the moment. I can't wait to see what you work on next. Thank you very much again for joining this podcast today. It was really lovely to have you, and I would like to take a moment at the end of this session to remind our listeners that the introduction to Erika and Holly's book is available in open access on the Gruyter website. So please do check it out. It's free to download and to share. Join the conversation. Thank you very much,
Myrto.